Thanks again for joining this morning for talking about ecosystem services modeling and in the context of forest and landscape restoration. So when we're talking about ecosystem services, we are basically talking about all of the multiple services and benefits that flow from ecosystems and natural systems to communities and people that support development, that support products and clean water, coastal protection, things like that. It's fundamentally an anthropocentric framing, which means that the goal of an ecosystem services assessment that distinguishes it from an ecosystems assessment is that the ultimate goal is to link the state of ecosystems to people and their well-being. So in the end, the goal is to improve outcomes of policies for both nature and for people. And so this requires that assessments pay attention both to how the interventions that you're considering change ecosystems, but also how these changes impact people. The Natural Capital Project is a partnership of the two U.S. universities, Stanford University, the University of Minnesota, and two international NGOs, the Nature Conservancy and the World Wildlife Fund. NatCap has partnered recently with IUCN to think about how ecosystem services information and models can be incorporated into the restoration opportunities methodology, the Rome process that's happening in countries throughout the world. And so this webinar is, of course, part of the series to help build capacity among IUCN staff and partners to incorporate this kind of information into the Rome assessments and into the recommendations that are made as an outcome of that process, so that restoration recommendations benefit, benefit ecosystems, but also benefit people. The Natural Capital Project has, tested our approach and our models and applications throughout the world. This map shows the applications that NatCap has been directly involved with, and it includes things like targeting restoration planning, like we're doing with IUCN, but also covers sustainable development planning at a national or regional level, planning for marine protected areas, looking at sustainable supply chains, payments for ecosystem services, and more. Our flagship set of models, InVEST, have been used in even more places than is shown on this map, and because we make the tool freely available for download. So InVEST was developed through a software science iterative process of particular applications where there are certain questions that need to be answered about ecosystem services, and then the science behind how do we know what impacts practices have on services and then how that impacts people, and then iterating with software development to come out with this set of tools that we call InVEST. So it's not just one model, it's a set of models for different ecosystem services that are free, open source, and what they have in common is they all assess changes in different ecosystem services from different management scenarios. You can download models, the documentation from our website. We also provide training, courses, and online user support through our forum, and the link to the forum is on the bottom right. We have a pretty active user community that helps each other find data and figure out troubleshooting the models and things like that. This is a schematic of the different models that are available in InVEST right now. We have in the green what we call our terrestrial freshwater models. So these are generally applied in inland areas, and things like crop pollination, annual and seasonal water yield, sediment retention, etc. Some of the ones with the orange we're still working on. Hope to have some new models released soon. We're always working on new models. And then in the blue on the right, we have marine models or coastal models like coastal protection, which evaluates the potential threat to coastlines and infrastructure from storm surge and sea level rise. and where natural capital ecosystems are protecting coastlines from those kinds of natural hazards. And then we have a few models that can be used in either marine coastal environments or terrestrial environments, like the habitat quality model, the recreation model that links visitation rates to features on the landscape, such as natural areas or roads or access points, things like that. So all of these are available, and it's also constantly changing. Every time I show this slide, it's already out of date because our recreation model has already been released. So things are still under development. So be sure and check the website for the latest and greatest in all of those models. So today I'm going to discuss the assessment of ecosystem services, specifically as part of the ROAM process. So estimating the costs and benefits of different FLR strategies in terms of their impacts on ecosystems and people through these different ecosystem services. And the ultimate goal typically in the ROAM process is to make recommendations about how much area to restore and then how that restoration should be implemented, which FLR activities and which locations are going to get have the biggest impact for the least cost or the least opportunity cost. So just to connect this to the ROAM process, this is a diagram that I copied directly from the ROAM handbook, which gives sort of the general process by which ROAM happens, which is, starts with identifying the restoration objectives, potential options, and then this whole phase of data collection, mapping, modeling, cost-benefit analysis, which then feeds into or is iterating with stakeholder engagement, and at the end, discussion of assessment results, making recommendations, and then implementation. And a typical ecosystem services assessment process would follow along more or less the same lines, but it's a little bit different. I want to highlight the places where they sort of connect. So just like in ROAM, when you do an ecosystem services assessment, you start with identifying your objectives and your problem statement, specifically as they relate to ecosystem services. And then from that, define the scope of what it is you're going to assess, how you're going to, which services, how you're going to model or evaluate those. And then as part of what ROAM calls the data collection phase, this is really where in an ecosystem service assessment, the real heart of the mapping and modeling would happen, which involves compiling data, often generating scenarios of different FLR interventions, assessing potential outcomes, perhaps doing some prioritization, multi-criteria analysis, or optimization to synthesize those results and then generate recommendations. And those recommendations would come in and be integrated with the other parts of the ROAM process somewhere near the end as recommendations are being sort of wrapped up together and then run by the stakeholders in some of the later workshops. So in this talk, I'm going to go through each one of these phases with a little bit of more information, and also throughout I'm going to use as a case study this work that we did in Uganda, in which case they were very interested in restoring forests to maximize benefits. Specifically wanted to know, what are the costs and benefits and trade-offs of different restoration investments, and where should you prioritize different or should prioritize restoration sort of generally in order to maximize ecosystem services and improve livelihoods at minimal cost. So the first step, of course, is defining objectives, and this is where you need to understand, first of all, what are the ecosystem services that you're interested in, and also the benefits that you would like to receive. I think sometimes people start with the services because they see, okay, these are the things we can model, or these are the things that this other country looked at. But I would argue that actually it's better to start from the benefits, like where are people's lives and livelihoods at risk, and where are they suffering because some of their services have been degraded. So I think that's a good place to start to identify, which ecosystem services people are dependent on and which ones are going to most improve their lives by being improved. And that's very important to define sort of the scope of which ecosystems and which kinds of activities are going to help achieve these goals, these objectives for the project. In Uganda, the objectives were selected based on stakeholder interviews and focus groups, and it's important to define these in an engagement process in order to encourage buy-in from the stakeholders and increase the likelihood that your results are going to be incorporated into decision-making processes in the end. The objectives that were chosen for Uganda were based on from the feedback that we heard that they're interested in these issues because they're issues globally that they could connect to sort of larger initiatives and international aid and that sort of thing. And also data were available to assess these. The data situation in Uganda was challenging. There's not a lot of data, so there was some compromise between important services and what could be done with the available data. So we chose carbon storage, habitat for biodiversity, water quality, and we want to minimize opportunity costs while we improve all these other things for Uganda. Now, in terms of articulating your objectives and your problem statement, I just wanted to make the point that the way that you articulate your objectives really drive your study design. And I want to give two examples that contrast to what this means in different places. So to start with, we have an example problem statement from Malawi. And in this case, they're really interested in what is the current level of ecosystem services provided by the landscape: carbon storage, water yield, water quality protection. And where do these ecosystem service priority areas overlap with other FLR priorities? And in this case, the analysis, this problem statement really calls for an analysis that looks at the baseline level of ecosystem services using the current landscape, and then uses those results in a multi-criteria analysis to identify priority areas, either to conserve where ecosystem services are high or to restore where ecosystem services are lower or are threatened. And we can contrast that with an example problem statement from Costa Rica, which is not the official problem statement by the IUCN team in Costa Rica, but was something that I think illustrates sort of the issues that we've seen when working with the Costa Rica team. That in that case, their question's a little different. They've already committed to implement FLR on a certain amount of land, and they have a certain budget, and they want to know, to implement this, which FLR practices are most applicable, where are the priority areas that I should implement each practice, because I want to maximize the improvement in multiple services and social benefits and also minimize costs. And so this problem statement calls for a different kind of analysis. In this case, we would look at the baseline ecosystem services, but now we also want to evaluate the ES impacts of these different FLR practices, how much they're going to change given different options, and then optimize the locations of where each of these practices would be to meet these multiple competing goals at the least cost. So the next step, once you have a good idea of kind of what your problem is and how, in some sense, of how you're going to approach it, this is when the scoping phase really starts. So you need to understand, who are the beneficiaries of the services you determined as priority. What is the geographic scope? This is important because the scope of an FLR or ROAM assessment could be the country or a region, but depending on the services you consider, that scope might need to be expanded. For example, if the region that you're looking at is part of a larger basin and that area is really dependent on water flows from the larger basin, you have to model the larger basin in order to have a sort of a complete picture of what's going on with the water. So that's important to consider early on because it affects your data collection. And also to think about, at what level will recommendations be made? Are we talking about doing recommendations for FLR at a district level, at a watershed level, at a at a pixel scale or a farm scale? And that's going to have implications for how you do your study design and also how you aggregate your results. So in the case of Uganda, we determined that districts were the unit at which they wanted to prioritize activities. So this is the map of districts in Uganda, which were used, and you can see in some of the later maps that these are the services within each district were aggregated in order to make recommendations of where changes would be more or less needed. So, and finally, with the scoping, it's important to consider what metrics are appropriate to demonstrate benefits and trade-offs, because metrics can take different forms. The model results from INVEST or other kinds of proxy data that you use to assess ecosystems usually come in the form of biophysical output. So we have, the amount of soil lost from croplands and how much that's reduced with a given FLR practice, or a specific increase in crop yields or an increase in carbon storage. And those metrics may be appropriate for your study, but you might also consider using economic metrics, so translating those biophysical outputs into some economic terms, such as an increase in farm revenues from compared to the scenario where your soil is degrading. Now you have soil that's retained on the farms through better practices, so you're going to have an increase in farm revenues. Or maybe you have increased revenues from ecotourism, from reforesting degraded areas. And finally, social metrics can also be a really important way to represent the outputs of your assessment. Could be things like the number of vulnerable people in each region whose ecosystem services are improved. And there's a lot of different metrics to consider. And I just wanted to, give the idea that it's not always biophysical and it's not always just money as either. In the case of Uganda, in this case, they did decide to go with biophysical indicators, but these are the 4 services that I mentioned earlier that were chosen for Uganda, and then the indicators that were used to represent the improvement or change in each of these objectives. So in the case of minimize opportunity costs, we actually used the value of agricultural production and the different, because we're considering restoration had implications for, depending on where it was done, there would be more or less value of agricultural production lost by taking that land out of production. And then once you sort of decide on the indicators, or actually sort of an iterative process with deciding on the indicators, is how are you going to measure or model these indicators? And of course, we talk about the INVEST model. That's what the Natural Capital Project is known for and what we use a lot, but it's not always necessary to use a process-based or a physically based model. Sometimes proxy data or expert opinion can also be used to generate metrics for your objectives. In the Uganda case, for increased carbon storage, we did use the INVEST carbon storage model. For Habitat for Biodiversity, was based on data on species richness and the distribution of species around the country. So it was more of a simple index model based on data from Red List and BirdLife. For drinking water quality, we used the INVEST sediment delivery ratio model to look at erosion and the change in erosion and sediment that reaches streams as a benefit from activities. And then I mentioned for opportunity cost, we used the value of agricultural production from this global study. So it's a mix of models, or of process-based models and sort of simple empirical models to generate these outputs for Uganda. So once you've decided on the method, then each of these methods is going to require compiling data, different kinds of data. One thing you have in common is sort of the land cover, land management map. But then in this case, we also needed things like climate, species distribution data, soils, especially for the sediment delivery ratio model, etc. So we mentioned different kinds of metrics, and this the social metrics were not used in Uganda, but I want to take a moment to talk about different ways to conceptualize tracking impacts to people. One concept that we use a lot in our work is the idea of service sheds, which is an area that a spatial area that provides a particular service to a particular set of people or communities. In this case, the first example is for water services. So imagine that you have this hypothetical landscape. We have a river, which is in blue, sort of flowing from top to bottom with a couple of different tributaries. We have 3 different communities, 1, 2, and 3. And we also have a manufacturing or industry that draws its water from this river on the right. So the point at which each of these communities draws their water is the outlet of their watershed or their service shed. So community 3 benefits from water provision in the entire upstream area in this lighter green. Community 1 is going to benefit from water and water quality regulation on the upper left part of this graph, etc. So let's assume that this is sort of our historical condition and we have a good condition forest, but at some point in the past, this area above community 2 has been converted into some degraded land use. So maybe it's like a suburban area has grown up in that watershed. And so now community 2 has experienced a degradation of their water quality because their service shed has been degraded. But because these other communities 3 and the industry are downstream, they've also seen a decline in their water quality. So say you're doing an FLR prioritization in the Rome process and you want to identify the best place to do restoration. So you can imagine a scenario where this area of dark green, we want to see what the impact is of restoring that area at the junction of these 2 rivers. And that could have positive water quality benefits for community 3. And if you're mapping sort of water quality regulation for this whole light green watershed, you would say, okay, great, water quality is improved. Good job. But by tracking where the people are that draw their water, you also then can better articulate that actually there's a trade-off here. By locating the restoration there, you've improved it for some people, but you've still not improved water quality for community 2 or for the industry. And sometimes those situations are difficult because community 2, there's not much watershed to be restored, so maybe they need another solution. But the idea is by tracking service sheds, you can be more transparent about how the locations of restoration connect to the communities and the people that depend on those services. And then just to provide a contrasting example, this is an example for pollination. In this case, we have in orange these 3 farm areas that have crops that are dependent on pollinators. And you might have the pollinator habitat, which is in yellow and red. And the places surrounding the farms within the flight distance of the pollinators, that can be thought of as the service shed for each one of those farms. So those farms are dependent on pollinator habitat within a certain distance from their farm. Pollinator habitat outside that area is not going to help them pollinate their fields. And so that's kind of the basis of our pollination model too, is to connect spatially the location of forests with the location of farms, and then how changes in that configuration is going to change the benefits that farms get from pollination. And then just to demonstrate that in a more specific way, this is an example from Peru, from our work there with looking for restoration opportunities to mitigate the impacts of road development. And so the 2 graphs, or I'm sorry, the 2 maps that we have here on the left are erosion control on the top and then nitrogen regulation. And so the darker areas here are going to be higher priority for restoration for either improving erosion control or for improving nitrogen regulation. And it says service supply because these are priorities based just on sort of the physical change in erosion or nitrogen that you would get from restoration in each of these areas. But now we also created a separate map, which is what we call service demand. And this is based on the population within these watersheds that would benefit from either erosion control or nutrient regulation. And so you can begin to see that these priority areas are different, and also that once you put them together and you overlay the supply and the demand, then the priority areas for erosion control really change. The areas that were high priority in the upper northern part are really no longer priority because they're not going to benefit communities, whereas the places in the south become much higher priority. And almost the opposite is true for nitrogen. So this is just one way, and actually a very effective, I think, and not that difficult way to overlay physical results from an ecosystem service assessments with locations of people, ecosystem dependent communities, in order to create priority maps that are at the intersection of both. So the next step then in the process is often to generate scenarios. But actually, I should say that in some cases, if you remember our Malawi example, scenarios weren't really part of the assessment. You know, it's enough to stop with, okay, where are ecosystem services now? Where are they supplied? Where are they demanded? Where do they overlap? Where do they need to be improved? And sometimes that's a place where you could stop. But in other cases, if you have the data and the capacity and the time to really dig more into looking at alternative options, then you would consider doing a scenario analysis, and that would be the next step here. So we often look at, the baseline, which is the map on the left, which is a certain configuration of ecosystems and land management on the landscape, and then you might generate one or more scenarios of FLR implemented, so changing the areas where lands are degraded into forest, or changing coffee into shade coffee, for example. And in Uganda, we looked at the restoration of forests based on the data from Hansen et al. Study on high-resolution global maps of forest change. So places where forest has been lost between 2000 and 2013 were treated as areas where restoration was possible. So we looked at a scenario where what happens if all that area is restored. We use the INVEST models to, based on all these biophysical data inputs, to calculate the change in the service if that restoration was implemented. And in this example, we have like the change in sediment lost to streams as a result of INVEST, and we do that for each of the services with the method that we chose. And then also, again, to reiterate that, looking at the supply side as one side, but also it can be interesting and important to intersect this with people. So in this case, you could look at the change in sediment loss to streams, overlay that with like the value of cropland and where that restoration may have more or less opportunity costs. Also overlay that with the population with access to safe drinking water, so people who don't have treated water would be more vulnerable to increases in or declines in water quality, and would benefit more from improvements in water quality. And then integrating those physical and social metrics together to provide a map of restoration priorities based on the ecosystem service benefits on the physical side as well as the social side. And then in the case of Uganda, this is an example of one of the ways that results were synthesized. So often there's this, you generate a lot of maps and you generate a lot of output, and this is where stakeholder input and engagement is really important to help hone in on what the message is, what the important take-homes are from the analysis. And in this case, we ended up with 4 different sort of summary maps of the opportunity for restoration of different areas based on different services. So in these maps, the green areas would be the high potential change in that service, and the purple areas would be the low potential change. So for carbon, the green areas are places where you would benefit the most from improving carbon from restoration, And biodiversity tends to follow in a similar area along the western, southwestern side of the country. And then the opportunity cost is the one you want to avoid. So you'd want to go to places where we're actually purple in opportunity cost. And by overlaying these results, begin to see, how and where the restoration should be implemented. We actually did go through another step in this process with Uganda, which was optimizing. So doing a multi-benefit optimization to identify, which places were the top places to invest based on these objectives. I'm not going to go into that today. We are having a second webinar in this series. We'll go in more details about tools and methods for doing these assessments. But today I want to just give you an idea of kind of what this looks like when we get to the point of synthesizing results. Another thing I wanted to mention, it was not part of the Uganda analysis, but getting back to this social benefit idea. These are results from Peru that I showed earlier, where we're looking at, on the right, you have a map of a lot of green area and blue where it's, areas that should be protected or restored based on their links to people's services and communities. But then on the left, we, understanding that there's you can't do everything everywhere. So what we call practical mitigation options were based on the high priority areas that were also considered a feasible amount of land to implement restoration on. And then in this case, we're also able to summarize this data in terms of who's been impacted by road construction and deforestation, by restoration, how much of that impact has been mitigated, and then breaking that out into indigenous and non-indigenous groups. So going a step beyond number of people into actually looking at distributional effects. And so I think that's a really interesting example of a way to really take the sort of the social metrics to another step that could be of interest to decision making in this process. And I'm not going to talk a lot about valuation because I think that that's something that the Rome partners have more experience in, but just to mention that is another way that results can be synthesized either through market or non-market valuation techniques to take the changes in the biophysical metrics and then relate those to costs or benefits to different sectors or different communities. And then the final stage in the process then is to communicate those results and iterate. And again, understanding the interests of stakeholders, staying in contact with the other parallel streams of work in the Rome process is really critical to understand, identify those entry points where the ecosystem services assessment is really going to speak to the larger decision-making process and how those results can best be wrapped up in order to have the greatest effect. And so, because ultimately we do want to use this information to shape the dialogue and inform the decisions. And so just in summary, the last thing I wanted to say was a little preview of the next webinar that we'll be doing, which is going to be getting more into details on, what do these tools look like to do the modeling, what are the steps in the process of sort of doing the baseline assessment, generating scenarios, the options for different kinds of overlays or prioritization or optimization. So that we're going to get into next time. Talk a little bit about the tools that we've been developing to account for the spatial variation and maximize benefits given different constraints. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us, and I'm happy to take questions, comments, feedback on any of this, and also how it might be helpful or useful in the Rome process.
Okay, well, thanks. It was very, very interesting. I have one direct question because it's something that we are still discussing how to include it in the example that you gave on, was it, in Peru, I think, you mentioned something about the feasibility.
Mm-hmm.
What was feasibility? Was it based on yeah, it would be interesting for me to know how you measured the feasibility of the scenario. Was it based on hectares or, I don't know, access to roads?
In that case, it was actually very simple. It was just that um, it was just based on interactions with stakeholders, and the general consensus was that there was no way that anybody was going to restore more than 20% of the landscape, or maybe it was 15%. I'm sorry, the exact number it's been a
Mm,
couple of years, but and so we
yeah,
we
yeah,
just turned that into an area constraint, and so where are the top places up to the 15% of the total possible area.
yeah, yeah. So it's based on you had the on individual farms as well, or
No, in this case we didn't have the individual farms. Yeah, I think, there's a lot more sophisticated thing you could do with looking at, yeah, like land change modeling, like where is it feasible based on roads, based on, we're struggling with this in Brazil too, because they have, part of the forest code is to restore 20% of each parcel, but not, getting access to data on the parcel boundaries is necessary before, otherwise you just say 20% of the landscape because you don't know where the
yeah, yeah,
20% of each parcel is. So yeah, it's always a back and forth.
yeah, no, no, absolutely. Um, Yeah, no, yeah, but that's so it's something that we have been discussing as well. We were also thinking about feasibility in terms of, for example, where your plant nurseries are, because if you
Mm-hmm.
don't have the material to restore, it's probably not very feasible, or you would have to consider in the budget then the the creation of new nurseries, etc., which would then increase
Mm-hmm.
the timeline and the costs, etc. But no, thank you
Yeah.
very much for the presentation. I definitely learned some new things.